When you think of Sweden, what comes to mind? Probably a progressive welfare state, right? A real model of social equality. But there's this really dark chapter in its history, a story of social engineering that kind of challenges everything we think we know. So get this. From 1934 all the way to 1976, there was a state-sanctioned program in place. And the result? Up to 63,000 people were sterilized. Most of them were women, and a lot of them against their will. And this wasn't some fringe idea. This was official government policy for over 40 years. And the impact? It was just devastating. This quote here from the secretary of the commission that finally investigated the program, it just cuts right to the bone. You see, this wasn't just some abstract policy. It was a deep personal trauma that left a permanent scar on thousands and thousands of lives. So you have to ask, right? How on earth could a country like Sweden let this happen? To really get it, we need to dig into the powerful ideas that were fueling this dark social experiment. This is really the core question. Because let's be honest, you hear a term like ethnic hygiene, and your mind immediately goes to totalitarian regimes. But Sweden's story is so chilling because it shows how these ideas can grow and even thrive in a democracy, with pretty much everyone on board across the political spectrum. And here's the wild part. This whole program wasn't built on ideas that people saw as hateful. No, it was built on an idea that, at the time, was considered cutting-edge science. That idea? It was eugenics. Now, we know it's a pseudoscience, but its goal was terrifyingly simple. Engineer a better society by controlling who could, and more importantly, who could not have children. It took big social problems like poverty or illness and reframed them not as economic or political issues, but as biological flaws that needed to be weeded out of the gene pool. And look, this didn't just pop up out of nowhere. This timeline shows how methodical it was, how an idea became state policy. It starts with a society in 1909, then it gets state legitimacy with a government-funded institute in 1922, the first of its kind in the world, by the way. By 1934, sterilization is being pushed as this perfectly rational solution to a national crisis. And here's the thing you have to remember. All of this was happening while Sweden was building its famous welfare state, the people's home. To a lot of people, eugenics wasn't a contradiction of that vision. It was part of it. It was a scientific tool to make sure the people's home was filled with healthy, productive people. So once you have the scientific and political backing, what's next? Well, you turn this dangerous ideology into law, giving the state this enormous power over the most personal parts of a person's life. The 1941 law gave authorities three really broad justifications. Medical grounds sounds reasonable enough on the surface, but eugenic and social grounds? What does that even mean? What's an undesirable trait? What's an antisocial lifestyle? That was the whole point. The language was deliberately vague, giving officials all the room they needed to target anyone they decided was unfit for their perfect modern society. It was social control, just dressed up as public health. So who got caught in this net? Well, the list is just heartbreaking. It was people with disabilities, sure, but it went so much further. It included ethnic minorities like the indigenous Sami people, poor families, and even kids in orphanages who were basically told they couldn't leave unless they agreed to the operation. It was a weapon for enforcing social and racial norms. And this chart, wow, it just lays bare the sheer scale and bias of the whole thing. About 63,000 people. But just look at that second bar. An absolutely staggering 90% of them were women. So this wasn't just about eugenics. It was profoundly about the state controlling women's bodies and their right to choose. And behind all these numbers are real people with real stories. Stories like Maria Norden's. She was labeled not very bright as a kid simply because she needed glasses that she didn't have. And based on that, a doctor forced her to sign the papers. The justification was so casual, but the consequences were absolute. It was a life sentence handed down by a doctor. Now, it's really easy to think, okay, this is some horrible World War II era stuff, it must have ended then. But in Sweden, the legacy of the state controlling who gets to have children stuck around for a shockingly long time. And this is the part that just blows my mind. The law wasn't fully repealed until 1976. 1976. This wasn't some pre-war relic. This was active law in modern Sweden, decades after the world saw the horrors of Nazi eugenics. And you can actually see the ghost of this kind of thinking in much more recent history. The same basic idea found a modern echo. From 1972 all the way up to 2013, the Swedish state required transgender people to be sterilized before they could have their gender legally recognized. It just shows this deeply troubling pattern of the state interfering with people's bodies and their right to make their own choices. For decades, this whole chapter of history was pretty much buried. But in the late 1990s, that silence was finally, and very loudly, broken, forcing the entire nation to reckon with its past. The big turning point was in 1997. A major newspaper started publishing articles that laid all the facts bare, and the public was just shocked. This was an ancient history. Thousands of victims were still alive. The public outrage was so huge, the government really had no choice but to launch a full investigation. And when that commission's report came out in 2000, it confirmed everyone's worst fears. They found that at least 21,000 people had been forcibly sterilized. Another 6,000 were coerced into a so-called voluntary procedure, being told they had to do it to get out of an institution or to receive welfare benefits. The line between consent and coercion had been completely erased. So how did the state respond to all this? Well, in 1999, they created a compensation scheme. But the wording here is so important. They offered an ex gratia payment. That's a legal term that basically means it's a payment made out of a sense of moral obligation, not because they're admitting they did anything legally wrong. It's like saying, here's some money because we feel bad, but we're not saying we broke the law. And what was this gesture of goodwill worth? Well, each victim who applied and qualified was offered a one-time payment of about 13,000 British pounds. For a lifetime of trauma, for having the choice to have a family taken away from you, that was the number the state landed on. Eventually, though, the official tone did a complete 180. The very same minister who at first had rejected compensation later came out and called the program barbaric. This quote really captures that total reversal in public, from defending the policy's legality to condemning its morality. So Sweden confronted its past, it acknowledged the barbarism, and it paid out compensation. But you have to wonder, is that really enough? Can money ever truly make up for what was taken away? It kind of forces all of us to ask a much, much bigger question about these kinds of historical injustices. What does real accountability and what does real justice truly look like?